Professor Balaban, dear Lorenzo, dear Dr. Chervyakov, esteemed colleagues, thanks for the generous invitation. It's a sheer pleasure to be with you this morning. Let's start the historical tour by looking at the Greco-Roman civilization. I suggest to follow the Socratic method by pointing out first what the ancients didn't know. There were no dissections and no experiments, with few but important exceptions. There was no idea of a circulation of the blood, and no consensus whether the brain or the heart was the instrumental organ for motor and sensory activities. You see here that Plato and most of the Hippocratics ascribed to the brain as the central organ, whereas Aristotle and some philosophers thought the heart was the center of motion and sensation. Given these circumstances, did the ancients come up with anything worth mentioning today? Yes, they did. First, they produced descriptions of the disease. For example, this one: pain suddenly seizes the head and the patient immediately becomes speechless and loses power over himself. Second, the ancients realized that stroke was characterized by a different set of symptoms and a different cause in comparison to other conditions they called epilepsy, lethargy, catalepsy, and so on. Third, they wrote at length about treatment and prognostics, including the world-famous aphorism, Hippocratic aphorism: it's impossible to cure a violent attack of stroke and not easy to cure a mild one. Finally, they set ethical standards how patients should be treated, standards which did not change very much until today in many parts of the world. At the end of the 2nd century AD, the famous physician Galen of Pergamon developed ideas of how the brain worked. According to him, first a so-called vital spirit was built in the heart and funneled to the brain via the arteries. This vital spirit was then transformed into animal spirit in a structure called retiform plexus. Only the animal spirit was stored in the cerebral ventricles, from where it acted on demand as a fuel for transmission of motor and sensory data to and from the periphery. So far, so good. In stroke now, phlegm, one of the 4 dominant humors in the human body, phlegm accumulated in the cerebral ventricles. The accumulation, there we are. The accumulation of this noxious humor blocked the flow of the animal spirit. This is the block here. And this blockage eventually resulted in palsy, sensory dysfunctions, and the loss of consciousness. Phlegm was cold, moist, and viscous. Humor which could accumulate in the brain when the body was exposed to too much cold, for example, during the winter or in old age. This theory, dear colleagues, was the fundamental etiological doctrine of stroke which dominated Western thinking for more than a millennium, more than 1,000 years. No text on neurological disorders up to 1750 can be understood without a solid knowledge of these Galenic principles. Fortunately, this doctrine was also the basis for therapeutic actions. A practicing physician and adherent of this doctrine had 2 basic options: evacuation, meaning cleansing the brain and the body, and counteraction, the 2 major meta-strategies of medical treatment until today. If you then add the four major realms of pre-modern treatment, that is physical therapy, dietetics, herbs, and surgery, you come up with a wide spectrum of therapeutic measures, ranging from hot bathing to various surgical procedures, including cauterization. So what we see in ancient times is a rational but speculative explanation of neurological symptoms. This explanation was only loosely tied to the observation of nature, but was deeply embedded in ancient philosophy. Harmony between man and world, harmony too between the various parts of the body were its key principles, a truly holistic approach. Medieval neurology is characterized by the traveling of ideas, first from the Greco-Roman centers of learning to the rising Islamic civilization, and then from there to the newly founded universities in the Latin West. I will skip this chapter because it's largely a story of textual tradition, albeit a fascinating one. When people talk about medicine in the Renaissance, they often use the metaphor of a wind of change blowing constantly over the European continent. Is that really true? Yes and no. As a matter of fact, from 1415 onwards, an increasing number of anatomical dissections were carried out, leading to a better knowledge of brain anatomy and brain vasculature. About a century later, the first autopsies were performed in order to discover bodily changes in certain diseases. Pathological anatomy was born. And in 1628, William Harvey used a variety of sophisticated experiments to prove that there is really something like a circulation of the blood, a circulation through the whole body, including the head and the brain. New methods, revolutionary findings, but what about their significance for the understanding of stroke? Practically zero, at least at the beginning. I'll just mention one example. In 1608, the Swiss physician Felix Platter carried out a brain autopsy after one of his apoplectic patients had died. He summarized his findings of the postmortem as follows. A phlegmatic humor is obstructing the inner passages of the brain. What can we learn from this quotation? Two things. Number one, scientific observations are always theory-laden. Second, it is very difficult to get rid of traditional beliefs. Platter subscribed to the old Galenic idea that stroke was caused by phlegm in the cerebral ventricles. What did he see? Phlegm in the cerebral ventricles. But finally, brain autopsies plus the idea of a circulation marked the end of the pre-modern era of stroke. A true figure of transition was another Swiss physician named Johann Jakob Wepfer. This is his portrait, and this is the title page of his famous monograph, the second edition. Many of my colleagues tend to classify Wepfer as a modernist and true reformer for good reasons. With Wepfer's research, stroke became a cerebrovascular disorder. First, because he was convinced that the pathological changes were located in the cerebral substance and not in the ventricles. And he was really one of the first physicians who realized that. Second, because he gave the hitherto most precise description of the encephalitic arteries. It's this line. including the circle of Willis. Furthermore, he discovered pituitous and fibrous formations, corpora fibrosa, pituitosa, in brain arteries, but of patients with non-apoplectic disorders, and therefore he supposed that these formations, may be clots, could also play an important role in stroke. Finally, Wepfer found a hemorrhage in about 50% of the brains, thus proving that the rupture of a cerebral artery can produce a subsequent attack. At the same time, however, Wepfer was still a true follower of Galen. If one reads his 400 pages monograph, which is written in a difficult Latin, one is surprised how old-fashioned many of his ideas on cerebral physiology and the etiology of stroke were. According to Wepfer, the obstruction of brain arteries is harmful because the little clots block the flow of the vital spirit from the heart towards the brain. A hemorrhage in the brain is disastrous because the animal spirit cannot flow towards the spinal cord and the nerves, and so on. Basically, Wepfer's concept of stroke is still an ancient one, only supplemented by the latest anatomical and pathological discoveries. The decisive difference between the pre-modern and the modern period of stroke is therefore not to be found in a single discovery or a set of new methods, but in a change of the basic notion of what a disease is. From Galen to Wepfer, stroke was defined as a collection of certain symptoms, sudden loss of consciousness, palsy, etc. In the modern era, however, stroke is defined as a result of a lesion. The lesion became the decisive criterion for an operational definition of stroke. The symptoms were now only seen as indicatory signs. Thus, at the beginning of the 19th century, morbid anatomy and nothing but morbid anatomy was the basis of all knowledge about stroke. The birth of this new way of perceiving a disease is inseparably linked to the Paris School of Medicine, and therefore it is no surprise that the first truly modern definition of stroke is to be found in a French publication. In 1812, the young physician Jean-André Rochoux produced what I call the most important dissertation in the history of neurology. He started with a phrase which is a platitude today, but indicated a scientific revolution when it was printed. Stroke is a hemorrhage of the brain by rupture with more or less serious alteration of its substance. First, Rochoux explained the lesion, then traced the sign and course of stroke, and concluded with a few remarks on treatment and prognosis. Undoubtedly, this monograph, this dissertation, which is on the left, and the monograph he produced 2 years later, are the first two modern texts on stroke, and if you ever have a chance to read the dissertation or the book, please do so. It's rewarding. Rochoux's examination or explanation remained not the only one. In the very same decade, another young doctor, Léon Rostand, came up with the idea that stroke must be the result of a softening of the brain, ramollissement du cerveau in French, or in modern terms, ischemic infarction. So by 1820, two basic modern concepts of stroke were discovered. They were both offspring of the anatomico-clinical method. They were both found through hospital-based research, and they were both based on early statistical observation. What follows during the whole 19th and a good part of the 20th century is, at least in my perspective, nothing but a refinement of these two basic concepts. From now on, we can therefore really talk about progress and milestones. For example, the discoveries by Rudolf Virchow, who described, starting in 1846, arterial thrombosis and embolism, and who recognized the interaction between the blood and the arterial wall. Furthermore, Virchow clearly showed that vascular occlusions caused infarction here, which again is a triviality today, but was a matter of scientific dispute in the 1840s. From the mid-19th century, medicine as a branch of knowledge was inextricably linked to the natural sciences. No theory as that of facts was the credo of the epoch, and a prominent German clinician put it even more bluntly: medicine will either be science or cease to exist. The understanding of stroke profited enormously from this positivistic movement. An increasing number of physicians, some of them specialized in neurology, contributed to the rapidly growing treasure of knowledge. It is impossible to enumerate all the important contributions, but one can at least emphasize some historical trends. From 1850 to 1930, vascular anatomy, vascular anatomy and clinico-anatomical correlations were of special interest, including various brainstem lesions. Between the 1920s and the 1970s, the pathophysiology of vascular lesions reached its heyday, including figures like the Frenchman Charles Foy, including figures like Kapitoline Volkov from St. Petersburg, and the American Miller Fisher. Permit me to say a few words about Kapitoline Volkov. Dr. Volkov worked at the Institute of Experimental Medicine in St. Petersburg and was one of the pioneers of angiology. In the 1920s and 30s, she worked on atherosclerosis of coronary and brain arteries. And as you can see, she published in German language, in German journals, like many Russian scientists. Before World War II, most high-ranking medical papers were mainly published in three languages: French, English, and German. It is as late as the 1940s that the rise of English as the dominant language in the sciences began. From about 1975 onwards, research on risk factors, stroke registries, randomized trials, as well as a general momentum for new treatment can be observed. So by the end of the 20th century, as you all know, stroke medicine became a subspecialty of neurology, theoretically as well as practically. To a large extent, however, this evolution was due to the technical development of neurological diagnostics. This the history of 20th century neurology is basically a history of technology. Almost every decade, a new technology was available from hands-on spinal tap around 1900 to the most sophisticated brain visualizations about 100 years later. Sometimes it was even difficult for the doctors' brains to keep up with the speed of technical innovation. So let me sum up by asking, is there anything you can take home from this historical tour? It is a matter of personal taste if one likes the idea of dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. However, knowledge about the history of one's own field almost automatically leads to professional and personal modesty, which is always a good attitude. An intellectual tour through history may raise our awareness of how intimately we are connected to the intellectual, technical, social context of our own epoch. We may or may not realize this frame. Galen, Wepfer, Rochoux, and all the great figures in the history of stroke, they all were products of their time, sharing certain opportunities and certain limits, and so are we. Perhaps the most valuable and paradoxical insight is that unthinking, not thinking, ideas of the past can be a key to great scientific success. The modern era in the history of stroke only became true because physicians of the early 19th century unthought all the misleading and constrictive presumptions which had been around for centuries. Therefore, I conclude with an encouraging quotation from my favorite French poet André Gide, who expressed the very same idea in a much more elegant way. One does not discover new continents without consenting to lose sight of the shore for a very long time. Thank you very much for your attention.